Okay, now let's think about the background and the origins of this article by McCloskey, Rhetoric of Economics. As I've said in previous seminars, when we're thinking about origins, you don't look at the publication date. You have to, because the date of publication is not when it was written, it's when it was published. So Hayek publishes his article on knowledge in the American Economic Review in 1945, but he didn't write it in 1945 at the end of World War II. He wrote it during World War II. Galbraith didn't write the new industrial state in 1967. He started drafts on it in the late 1950s. So when you're thinking about the context in which an article is written, don't look at the publication date. Look at the period before, insofar as you know when that period is roughly. I think we can say the general backdrop to the origins of this article. It's not the backdrop to this article. The backdrop to the origins of this article are, roughly speaking, the 1970s. What's so special about the 1970s? The 1970s are a period of serious upheaval of economic, social, cultural, political upheaval, of change, of all of the old certainties from the 1950s maybe eroded to some extent in the 1960s, but they've crumbled by the 1970s. So we have, for example, stagflation, we've got rising unemployment and rising inflation at the same time, and there doesn't seem to be any clear solution to that problem. So we have this uncertainty, this policy uncertainty about that amongst economists. We've got the rise of the new left in politics and the rise of the new right as well. It's emerging. The new right will become dominant in the 1980s, but their origin, they begin really to flex their muscles in the 1970s. And these are, the new left and the new right are new. That is, not only are they opposed to each other, but in some sense they're opposed to the old left and the old right. We've got student radicalism, we've got student protests, there's the aftermath of the Watergate scandal in 1972 to 1974, which results in many Americans kind of losing their faith in their political representatives and the President of the United States. We have the emergence of the women's liberation movement, the gay rights movement, the animal liberation movement, and we've also got a proliferation of new genres of music and fashion and so on. You might say, well, that's all fluff, but it's not really. I mean, those, all sorts of new musical genres were quite confronting to an older generation of people. This was something really radical. Led Zeppelin, AC/DC, Queen were not, it wasn't Cole Porter. It wasn't Elvis Presley. This is something new and challenging to established understandings of what's acceptable music and what's acceptable behaviour. And the themes that come out of it too reflect this uncertainty and this instability. Think, for example, of The Who, their song "Who Are You?" Go have a look at it on YouTube. You see, it's really it's questioning everything, and so there is this kind of social, political, and cultural upheaval, and that, I think, bleeds into the ivory tower, and you start to see the influence of that, I think, to some extent, on academics reacting to this decade. Why is that important? Because I think what we'll see is that the works that McCloskey starts reading are works, at least a number of them, are from this 1970s period where there's this challenge to the status quo, the rethinking of what's acceptable behaviour and what's not, or what's acceptable thought and what's not. Alright, so that's kind of the backdrop. So we've got this backdrop, and now I'll just read a bit from the preface to the book by McCloskey, The Rhetoric of Economics. It gives you a sense of what's happened in McCloskey's thinking. So she says, sometime in the late 1970s, I stopped being a persuaded positivist. So a positivist here is someone who, and we'll see this in the article, but someone who holds to a kind of a view of science and being a scientist that's really focused on rigorous, logically coherent and deduced theory, which generates predictions, which you then test by observing the world objectively and drawing conclusions about whether your theory is objectively true or objectively false based on that empirical evidence. So that's kind of the back of the envelope notion of positivism here. If you're not doing that, then you're not doing science, and if you're not doing science, you don't really know anything. Alright, so by the late 1970s, she says she's starting to think, this doesn't fly. At the University of Chicago, where I taught for a dozen years from 1968 to 1980, the economist preached a simpleton's version of positivism. That's what I just gave you, the simpleton's version of positivism. That's fine, but she notices something at the University of Chicago. There's this disconnect between this official line of how to be a good economic scientist and what her actual experience of economists arguing with each other. She goes on to say, yet the brilliance of the actual scientific talk in seminar and lunchroom by my fellow Chicago economists — Chicago in the 1970s was the most creative department of economics in the world — contrasted strangely with the simpleton's science recommended by the methodology. So she notes that what the real economists are doing is not what they say officially that they're doing. There's a different style of argumentation, a different means by which you're arguing, a much richer, more varied kind of means of argumentation. Now, this might be, well, you could probably say that that's true everywhere, but it might be especially true at Chicago. David Collander and Craig Friedman, historians of economic thought, amongst other things, have written about the style of, or the atmosphere in the Department of Economics at Chicago University, especially when George Stigler and Milton Friedman were there. But also, to some extent, a bit after that as well, when McCloskey would have been there. And they talk about how a better analogy, an analogy that you might use to try and understand how the Chicagoans engaged with each other would be to, if you think of a court case, the Chicagoans might present themselves or say that oh, I'm the forensic investigator who gets called in to provide evidence, right? And I just tell the truth as it is. They might say that, but what in fact they're doing is acting as prosecutors and defense counsel. That is, they're arguing in freewheeling debate in a very competitive, very combative way with each other. No holds barred, no concern for people's feelings, trying to win arguments against each other. And they use every weapon at their disposal to try and win their argument, to persuade their interlocutor that they're right and the other is wrong. And this was, Collender and Friedman argued, that this is characteristic of the Chicago Economics School in particular. Now, if McCloskey is experiencing that, then there's no doubt that she would have noted that there's clearly that there's a disconnect here between the official story of what is being done and what economists actually do when they argue with each other. Note that we read the article by Ed Lima, Let's Take the Con Out of Economics and Econometrics, and there's something similar going on there to some extent. I mean, he's saying that on the one hand, we have this official story about econometricians being objective scientists who are just reporting the truth and so on. But he's saying, in fact, that's all nonsense. That's not what's really going on at all. In fact, we're dealing with opinions which we're struggling to justify with the very limited resources that we have. And it tends to be plumped up by a rhetoric which is to some extent deceiving, right? So we need to think about what's really going on. McCloskey's saying something similar, or he's noting something similar. All right. Now, so that's kind of a background. Now, I think many economists and people from all sorts of other disciplines as well will definitely notice that there is this disconnect between the way people act in the seminar room and the way that they present publications or their arguments in publication. What triggers McCloskey to write something about it? Well, we get a clue in here from the acknowledgements from the first edition. The germ of the book, and therefore really the germ of the article, was presented as a talk to the old program of politics, economics and rhetoric and law as I left the University of Chicago in 1979-1980. Wayne Booth was a professor of English literature at Chicago. Wayne Booth asked me to talk on the Rhetoric of Economics, and I said, sure, glad to. What is it? So McCloskey didn't really know what this Rhetoric of Economics was, so drew on the resources that she had available to her and that she felt were most appropriate. And here's where I'll link back to the 1970s, because a number of the academic sources that she draws upon in order to the base sources that she draws upon to help write this article, in addition to her experience as an economist, are works that, at least a few of them, come out of the 1970s and reflect the kind of social upheavals that are occurring and the intellectual questioning of the status quo. Not necessarily the social status quo, but sometimes. And the best way in which to deal with this social and cultural upheaval which is occurring. So if we read on, she says, I had read Paul Feyerabend's Against Method a little earlier, picking it up by accident in a bookstore, and found it congenial. Paul Feyerabend is a philosopher of science who writes this this book in 1975 called Against Method, in which he makes the case that if you look at the history of physics, in particular, for example, Galileo, you find that the official story by positivists and by, for example, the philosopher Karl Popper, the story that they tell about how science is conducted and should be conducted is at variance to the actual history, the actual conduct of actual great scientists. So who are we to believe? Are we to believe Karl Popper and Karl Hempel and Carnap and others about what science, how science is conducted, or should we look at what actual scientists do? And he says, well, we should be really looking at what actual scientists do. And what actual scientists do is a whole variety of different things. There's no one single method or general approach that scientists use in order to conduct their investigations, and importantly, in order to persuade their peers that what they're doing is legitimate and realistic and true and convincing. So you can see that this gels with what McCloskey is experiencing in the seminar room in Chicago. Then goes on to say Booth's Modern Dogma and Rhetoric of Assent, and on Booth's recommendation, Michael Polanyi's personal knowledge prepared me for the Chicago talk, and a little bit later I read the book of another Chicago colleague, Stephen Tolman's The Uses of Argument, picked up again by chance in a bookstore. Glory be to bookstores. Yes, here. So, if we look at these other, just quickly, these other books, Wayne Booth's book, he's the guy who invited McCloskey to the seminar. Wayne Booth's book, Modern Dogma, it was written, I think, 1972 or 74, I think, but in the 70s. And that actually is a direct response to student protests that were occurring on campuses, where student radicals in particular, where Booth was concerned that people were just shouting each other down and arguing past each other. They weren't really communicating with each other, and therefore you could never really resolve debates. Debates per se weren't really occurring. It was just shouting down each other, and in that case you don't have reasoned argument to the best conclusion, but you simply have whichever group is more powerful in the moment will overwhelm the other by force, maybe by verbal force, but his concern was that this is not the best way in which to resolve disputes. Rather, you need a means of reasonable argumentation in order that one party can potentially persuade the other party. So this entailed a study, and surprise, surprise, he's a professor of English literature. This involves the study of rhetoric, that is the art of persuasion. And he thinks that this is a way forward to bring about a more congenial and more acceptable kind of conversation or debate on university campuses, and perhaps beyond that as well. Perhaps that's a kind of relevant thing for the United States today. And then there are the books by Karl Polanyi and Stephen Tolman. Polanyi's book, Personal Knowledge, is it's very hard to kind of capture it in a nutshell, but it's basically it's an anti-positivist book. That is, it's making the case that the scientist is not some kind of objective measuring instrument. It's not like a biological version of a thermometer or something like that. The scientist is a flesh and blood human being who has to become inspired and has to get a feel for the data, has to come to believe the theories that they hold and to pursue them as best they can in their particular field, knowing that they're part of a broader project of other individuals who are similarly striving to try and get a feel for what's right and ultimately to persuade others by the veracity of their findings. But their findings only come about if it's a kind of personal experience on the part of the individual scientist. And then we've got Stephen Tolman's The Uses of Knowledge. By the way, these last two books are from the 1950s. Stephen Tolman's The Uses of Knowledge, The Uses of Argument. And this is a book which, when it came out in the 1950s in Great Britain, was regarded by philosophers of logic and logicians as outrageous. And he made the argument, ironically, that pure deductive reasoning and some kind of an attempt to construct a rigorous inductive logic were, interesting little intellectual exercises, but they weren't how real human beings argued with each other. And if we want to have a discipline which is informing real debates, real arguments between real people, you need to look at how people actually persuade each other. And Tolman argues that there's a variety of different ways, different forms of argument that economists or philosophers or the man on the street or the woman on the street, to a lesser extent the child on the street, uses in order to persuade other people, to convince other people that what they're saying is legitimate or right or warranted. So, for example, you might argue from analogy, right? You might argue from authority. And a lot of these kinds of arguments in the standard logic textbook are classified as fallacies. But Tolman says they're not necessarily fallacies. They can be legitimate arguments that have some weight, that have some force, and they're not crazy. They're sometimes entirely reasonable. So these are the sources that McCloskey draws upon in order to begin to write the article. Okay, and we'll see, I think, evidence of what I just talked about from these works. We'll see evidence of that in these works. There's one other book that McCloskey doesn't mention right here, and that is a book by the philosopher Richard Rorty called Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. And this is a kind of pure philosophy textbook. It focused particularly on epistemology. And in that Richard Rorty argues that the kind of core model or core metaphor that philosophers have relied upon in order to understand the concept of knowledge, this notion of a mirror, that is, your mind is a mirror of the world in some way, that your mind reflects what's occurring in the world, either drawing upon experience of the world, and this provides the foundation for your knowledge, certain foundation for your knowledge, or by a priori deduction from pre-existing self-evident axioms in the mind, you can draw certain, that is, guaranteed true conclusions about the world. That this notion, he argues, is incoherent, and yes, it's incoherent and it's dogmatic. that's not how we should really think about knowledge in general. So Rorty ends up arguing for something like a more pragmatic notion, or a pragmatist notion of knowledge, which is what works to some extent. That is, our knowledge is always fallible, it's always revisable, it's always historically situated, and it's always possessed by human beings who are, in some sense, broken vessels. That is, they're imperfect beings. And so this notion that we can have some kind of transcendent, godlike knowledge of reality in and of itself, or, for Kant, for example, we can have some kind of knowledge of, at least certain knowledge of the noumena, the world of experience. He says it's just wrong. This is also something that appears in McCloskey's article as well. Alright, so that's some background origin material. Let's go to the article.